They called it the 5 Points of Fellowship. The pledge whispered in the shadows of the lodge. That my hand, given to a master mason, shall be a sure pledge of brotherhood. It wasn't just ritual, it was a bond. Loyalty without question, obedience without hesitation. Once you took that oath, you weren't just yourself anymore. You were part of something bigger, a silent column of mutual defense. Critics of Freemasonry always came back to that secret vow. They said it created a kind of loyalty that blurred the lines between right and wrong. A brotherhood that could override the law itself. Inside that circle, men stopped thinking for themselves. They thought as one, acted as one, protected one another, no matter what. And that protection, many believed, had seeped deep into places it didn't belong, into the police, into government, into the very machinery of public life. Even long-time Masons were starting to speak up. Some admitted they were troubled by what they saw. Corruption, favoritism, power abused under the cover of brotherhood. Grand Lodge needs to clean house, one of them said. They either don't see it, or they're choosing not to. And if we don't put out the fire, it'll burn the whole thing down. One of those men was a retired engineer from Brighouse, Yorkshire. 30 years in the Brotherhood, and now he was disgusted. He believed senior Masons were shielding one another, covering up wrongdoing. His fears sharpened around the case of a former London policeman named Brian Willard, a man who said the Masons had destroyed his career. If Willard's wrong, he should face the consequences, the engineer said. But if he's right, then God help the people responsible. The public deserves to know the story began in 1981. Chief Inspector Brian Willard had been assigned to a fraud case in Islington, one of London's boroughs. The job seemed straightforward enough. Investigate allegations that council officers in the Building Works Department were authorizing inflated payments to contractors in exchange for bribes. The rumors were ugly. Cash passing hands, lavish meals in West End nightclubs, edible gifts, as one report called them. The deeper Willard looked, the worse it got. At 123 Sussex Way, the borough had paid £2,300 for a new roof, a roof that was never built. At 53 Kingstown Road, 2 different building firms had been paid for the same renovation job. At 25 Landseer Road, a contractor was paid 4 times the original contract price. The Evening Standard broke the story wide open, and the council called in the fraud squad. But for 9 months, the investigation went nowhere. Then Willard took over, and everything changed. A tip reached his desk. A contractor getting a suspicious amount of work from the council and a senior official handing out those contracts were both Masons, brothers from the same lodge. It was a new angle, and Willard knew it. The Masonic connection was uncharted territory. But as soon as he started pulling at that thread, strange things began to happen. 2 phone calls hit his office almost immediately. One was from the contractor, now under suspicion. The other came from the Director of Public Prosecutions, Assistant Deputy Director Richard Thomas himself. Willard had never heard from anyone at the DPP's office in the middle of an active case. Ever. And now, out of the blue, one of the top men in the department was on the line. The timing was too perfect. Willard suspected Thomas was a Mason too, and that one of the men he'd been questioning had tipped him off. It wasn't just that he called, Willard later said. It was when he called. Right after I'd interviewed a senior official who was a Mason. That official's deputy vanished immediately afterward, went on sudden leave. It looked like they were scrambling, trying to cover things up. Willard faced a problem. 2 of his superiors in the fraud squad were also Freemasons, and in the same lodge as the council suspects. Going through normal channels now felt dangerous. So, he broke procedure. Without asking permission, he went straight to Thomas and questioned him directly. "What prompted you to call me?" Willard asked. Thomas admitted that he may have received a phone call from outside before contacting Willard. Exactly what Willard had suspected. Willard reported the meeting to Scotland Yard and the fraud squad headquarters. Hours later, he was pulled off the Islington case. The official reason: he had broken the chain of command. Nobody really believed that was the whole story. Investigators and observers alike said the same thing. Willard's problems began the moment Freemasonry entered his inquiry. He had found evidence, or at least the trail of it, that contracts were being awarded based on Masonic ties. And once he followed that trail, he was silenced. With Willard gone, the fraud squad reported that it had found no evidence linking Freemasonry to corruption in Islington. The DPP's office reviewed the file and marked it no further action. But there was further action, just not against the council. Willard became a ghost overnight. They stuck him in a back office where he spent 5 weeks doing nothing but reading library books. Finally, he was summoned by Deputy Assistant Commissioner Ronald Stevenson, another Freemason, as Willard later discovered. Stevenson didn't mince words. Willard, he said, was not a fit person to work in plain clothes or in any specialist department. He would be transferred back to the uniform branch. Willard asked if anyone had filed a complaint against him. Stevenson's answer was blunt. "You caused embarrassment." It wasn't just a British story. The reach of the Masons stretched across the Atlantic too. In the United States, high-ranking police officials, commissioners, and powerful men in public life wore the same aprons and swore the same oaths. Even J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful lawman in America, had begged to join. They were more than a fraternity. They were an invisible government. The Mafia understood that kind of power. In Sicily and America, they had their own rituals. A gun on the table, a prick of blood, a few solemn words. Their code was the same: loyalty, trust, and an unbreakable wall of protection. The brotherhoods of the underworld and the brotherhoods of the establishment weren't as far apart as people liked to think. Gangsters weren't just lurking in alleys. They were in boardrooms, on university faculties, in banks, and in film sets. Doctors, scientists, politicians, actors, all part of the same network shaping the world behind the scenes. In 1957, the world caught a glimpse of it. A meeting of Mafia bosses in upstate New York was raided by police, and suddenly the American public saw what had been hiding in plain sight. A secret society so powerful that even the most feared lawman in the country hadn't seen it coming. The revelation changed everything, but not enough. Americans still didn't fully understand the history unfolding around them, or how much of it was being written in back rooms and lodge halls. That's the story. The one hiding behind handshakes and whispered oaths, behind titles and uniforms and carefully drawn blinds. It's the story of how loyalty can become a weapon, and how a promise made in secret can bring down a man who thought he was only doing his job. They didn't meet in a smoke-filled bunker. Didn't have to. The deal ran itself. Netanyahu visits Washington, kissing rings on the Hill, ducking into the White House. The chatter said airstrikes on Iran were back on the menu. You could feel the ladder of escalation getting another rung nailed in. The reason wasn't a mystery. It was a crew of 4 outfits, each climbing the same mountain for their own payoff. First crew, the Christian Zionists, true believers. They want the prophecy, not the politics. Their plan is simple: pave a road up the holy mountain, even if people already live on it. If they stand in the way, their history, cost of doing business with God. Second crew, the Zionists. They're in because the deed to the mountain is written in their book. Greater Israel, the Old Covenant, squared and notarized. They need the road, the muscle, the cover. In the believers, they see a vehicle. In themselves, a sacrifice the heavens can't ignore. Third, the money men, Wall Street, the city. They don't care about God, they care about toll booths, If a road is going up the mountain, they finance the asphalt and lease the air. They'll sell you your own breath if the price is right. No ideology, just yield. Fourth, the American Empire. Bureaucrats with badges and budgets, cushy chairs, cold air, hot rhetoric. They want to justify the armor, the fleets, the bases. If the faithful and the nationalists handle the lobbying and the shouting, the empire promises protection. Minimal sweat, maximal appropriations. They're not a conspiracy. They don't need to talk. They share a direction, not a table. Once they crest the peak, they'll knife each other over methods, boots on the ground versus patient strangulation. But for now, they march. Why the believers call the shots, even when the bankers hold the cash and the empire holds the guns, comes down to a street rule dressed up like math. Mass times energy times coordination. Mass is head count, but not just bodies. Cohesion. 10 men who trust each other beat 100 who don't. Energy is will, real will. Not sweat, but the mental kind. The ability to say, I'm wrong, kill the ego, and change fast. That costs. Most people won't pay. Coordination is king, weighed 3 times heavier than mass, twice heavier than energy. Move as one, you win ugly. 2 kinds of coordination, conscious and subconscious. Conscious is a boss, a committee, a memo. It leaks, it breeds ego, it breaks under pressure. Subconscious is the dance, the family pulse, the faith current, the code. No minutes, no meetings, no case to make in court. It's deniable, frictionless, dangerous. That's why conspiracies rot from the inside. Secrets spill, laws trip you, pride gums the gears. But a shared story? That's a ghost that moves people without ever showing its face. So, the 4 outfits climb. The Christians frame the mission like destiny, highest energy in the room. The Zionists bring history, cohesion baked in. The financiers wire the mountain, tolls guaranteed. The empire posts guards and invoices the view. Each step up tightens the noose on Tehran. Each handshake, each photo op, another inch toward jets warming on runways. Nobody needs a bunker. They've got something stronger. Mass aligned by faith, energy fueled by certainty, and coordination that doesn't look like coordination at all. They say the game of power isn't about strength or money. It's about numbers, hunger, and how well you move in sync. Mass, energy, coordination. That's the formula. And in that order, it's backwards from what most people think. Mass is the least of it. Energy counts for more. But coordination is king. That's why the most dangerous forces in history don't gather in smoky backrooms or leave trails of signatures on secret documents. They don't need to. The real empires are built in silence, not conspiracy. Families, tribes, religions, they move together without needing orders. Like a flock turning mid-air, they don't argue, they don't leak. They just move. That's subconscious coordination. And it beats any plan cooked up under a chandelier. This is how power organizes itself now, in the Middle East and everywhere else. 4 blocks, 4 interests, each one chasing its own prize, but all walking the same road up the same mountain. The Christian Zionists want prophecy fulfilled. The Zionists want a promised land secured. Wall Street and the city sniff profits in every warhead and pipeline. And the American empire? It's got bureaucrats in air-conditioned rooms who need to prove their budgets are worth the blood. They don't have to sit at the same table. They don't even have to like each other. They're like 4 crews from 4 different families who happen to want the same man dead. One swinging a hammer for God, another's counting the payoff, another's staking territory. It's messy, cynical, temporary, but they're moving in the same direction. And that's enough. If this coalition gets its way, Iran will burn. The preachers and zealots will demand troops on the ground. The financiers and strategists will wring their hands about risk, whisper about slow change. But zealotry usually wins the argument, because zealotry burns hotter. It's the energy in that equation. And nothing outlasts fanatical energy harnessed to tight coordination. The same rule holds at every level. In a duel, energy wins. The one most obsessed with improvement beats the one swinging harder. In a team, it's energy and coordination together. And in the biggest game of all, the nation-state, the ones with story and unity crush those with only size. The US dominates the Western Hemisphere. Germany still anchors Europe. Japan holds East Asia. And in the Middle East, Israel, small but cohesive, punches far above its weight. The trick, the real magician's trick, is story. You don't glue millions of strangers together with policy papers. You do it with stories that feel older than time. Stories that answer the questions nobody can stop asking. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? Out of all the tales humanity has told, 3 haunt us most. Plato's cave, the truth-teller dragged into the light and punished for it. Christ's crucifixion, the truth sent by God, murdered for daring to reveal it. And the second comes the promise that one day the story ends in paradise. They're not 3 stories. They're one story, retold again and again, and the Christian Zionists have built an empire on it. That story gives them fire. It makes them unstoppable. And history repeats itself in strange disguises. 1,500 years ago, the world was burning under a war between Byzantium and Persia. The Jews were scattered, banned from their holy city, clinging to prophecies of return. Their rebellions crushed by Rome, their armies fled into Arabia. The one place Roman steel refused to follow. And there, exiles and pagans began to merge their myths. The Jewish vision of a Messiah seeped into desert sands and took root among Arab tribes. From that soil rose a man. His name is mostly lost to time, but we call him Muhammad. To some who waited for deliverance, he was the Messiah, the one to crush empires, free the enslaved, erase debts, and unite the children of Abraham under one God. He preached tolerance. He called factions a con. And his movement swept across the old order like a storm. Jerusalem fell. The Jews returned. A great house of worship rose, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, seen then as a third temple. And what followed was a golden age, a season of learning and justice, fragile but real. Many Jews joined it. Many helped build it. But the companions of Muhammad, the first believers, were consumed by power struggles once he was gone. The revolution devoured its children, as revolutions often do. Still, the story lived on, and the story still rules. That's why Christian Zionism isn't a passing mood. It's the most powerful engine in the modern world. It fuels policy. It shapes wars. It binds people tighter than fear or money ever could. And yet, power never stands still. When the players settle into their patterns, when their moves become predictable, something else always steps in. A new player. A man who sees the whole board and rewrites the rules. Hegel called him the world historical figure. Nietzsche called him the Übermensch. He's the one who steps outside the story and makes it his own. Today, that man has a name. Vladimir Putin. Before we talk about power, we have to talk about perception. And for that, we need Immanuel Kant, the godfather of Western philosophy. He laid out one brutal truth: we can never know reality as it truly is. Out there, beyond our reach, exists what Kant called the noumenon, the world as it is in itself. But we don't live there. We can't. Everything we know is filtered through our senses, reshaped by our minds into something we can handle. That reshaped version is the phenomenon, the world as it appears to us. Time and space. They're not out there floating around in the universe. They're scaffolding we build in our heads so that chaos makes sense. What we call reality is a masterpiece of imagination, a hallucination so consistent we mistake it for truth. And if that's true, then thinking isn't about memorizing facts. It's about sharpening your imagination until you can see the hidden shapes beneath the illusions. That's the point of this whole project. We're not here to fill your head with what to think. We're here to train you how to think. We'll walk through the past, present, and future. Not to memorize dates and names, but to reverse engineering power. We'll build models, test them against events, and then use them to unearth the hidden architecture of history. The secret history buried under the official version you were spoon-fed. Because that version? It's a story someone else wrote to keep you compliant. And if you can understand how power really works, you can break the spell. You can stop being a pawn and start being a player. Let's start with one of power's oldest tricks: money. Picture this. I open a bank. You and 100 others deposit $5 million. You do it because I promise you a tidy 1% interest, a safe return. But to pay that, I need to make more money. So I lend that $5 million to a friend who's opening a restaurant. He promises me 10% back. I pocket the 9% difference. At first glance, this is simple. You put in $5 million. I lend out $5 million. Logically, there's $0 left in the vault. That's what textbooks tell you. But reality doesn't care about logic. In reality, the system now behaves as if there's $10 million in circulation, $5 million in your account, $5 million in the loan I created. That's how banks create money out of nothing. And it's why Chinese banks exploded into the largest in the world. Not because citizens suddenly got rich and dumped cash into vaults, but because the banks started conjuring money into existence to build skyscrapers, roads, entire cities. How did we end up with this sorcery disguised as finance? The answer is old. Older than most nations. It started with merchants. They needed capital to grease the wheels of trade. People deposited gold with them for safekeeping, and in return, they got a receipt, a promise that they could reclaim their gold at any time. These receipts were easier to move than sacks of gold, so merchants started trading them directly. Over time, the receipt became as valuable as the gold itself. Then, a banker had a dangerous thought. Most depositors never come back for their gold all at once, so why not lend some of it out, not the gold itself, but more receipts? And so, with one pile of gold, the bank issued 2 piles of paper. Money was born twice over, and value became something that existed mostly on paper, in promises, in imagination. But there's a catch. If too many people show up demanding their gold at the same time, the illusion shatters. The vault's empty. The bank collapses. That's a bank run. And once the trust is gone, the receipts are just paper. Another problem. In the old world, bankers didn't lend to entrepreneurs. They lent to kings. And kings didn't always pay back. Sometimes they died in battle. More often, they just decided they didn't have to honor their debts. After all, who was going to make them? So, the merchants adapted. They built cartels, networks of banks across cities and kingdoms that pooled resources and shared risks. Power protects itself. It learns. It coordinates. Even money itself, the blood pumping through the body of power, is an illusion built on trust, a phenomenon shaped by perception. It only works because we all agree to believe the story. The moment we stop believing, the whole thing collapses. Kant was right. Reality isn't something we find. It's something we build. And the people who build it, who shape how we see the world, they're the ones who hold the reins. How do banking dynasties keep themselves alive? They marry. Bloodlines fuse, balance sheets merge, and suddenly a network becomes a family. If one house faces a run, say depositors holding $15 million in receipts demand gold, and there's only $10 million in the vault, Another house quietly supplies the metal. If a king decides debt is optional, the houses don't beg. They convene. They underwrite his enemies. Soon there's a new king who remembers who financed the throne. That intermarried web is the ancestor of what we call today central banking. A cartel with polite stationery. Power's trick isn't subtle. It turns nothing into everything. A contract becomes currency. A promise becomes purchasing power. Once you see that, the next question is obvious. If money can be created at will, why poverty? If there's enough food to throw tons of it away every day, why hunger? You were trained to answer with one word: scarcity. But scarcity is the story that keeps the game running. Money is not scarce. Discipline is. So, the system manufactures an artificial shortage of money to keep you moving. Alarm clock ringing, bills due, back to class, back to work. Poverty, then, isn't a personal failure. It's policy. It is how the price of money is maintained. Without visible misery, desire collapses. Parents can't say, study hard or you'll end up like that. Bosses can't say, you're lucky to have a job. A world without losers would shatter the motivational architecture of the game. And crisis? Crisis is the seasonal burn. Market crashes, recessions, necessary corrections. These are controlled demolitions of excess money and paper wealth. They reset fear, restore the mystique of scarcity, and make the remaining tokens feel precious again. War does the same thing at industrial scale. It vaporizes assets, consumes inventories, erases surpluses, and reminds everyone that credits are fragile and life is cheaper. If this all sounds like World of Warcraft, that's because it is. The server could shower you with gold every login, but then you'd stop grinding. So, the loot table is tight, the drop rate stingy, and you log on tomorrow. Now pivot. Happiness. You listed the usual suspects: money, power, freedom, friends, love, leisure. Notice what links them. The individual. That's a modern obsession. For most of human history, the unit of happiness wasn't the isolated self. It was the web. If your village suffered, your joy had no footing. Reputation meant generosity, not accumulation. That's why, in the old stories, when someone struck gold, they didn't bury it in a field for their grandchildren. They threw a feast. The point wasn't to hoard, it was to bind. You fed the village, and the village remembered. Wealth converted to honor, obligation, and safety. Your treasure became relationships you could call on when storms came. Somewhere along the way, the feast turned into a portfolio, and the village into a market. The story changed, but the old architecture still works. Community compounds resilience. Generosity buys the only insurance that actually pays out. So, here's the through line. Cartels marry, coordinate, and control the weather of money. Poverty and crisis aren't glitches, they're features that keep the machine humming. War is the fastest asset shredder on Earth. And the antidote to a scarcity script isn't hoarding more tokens. It's rebuilding the we, because collective abundance is the one surplus they can't repo. We don't have to accept the current story. Remember Kant. The world you move in is the world your mind assembles. Change the script, and the set rearranges itself. They built banks the way priests built temples, not to serve the people, but to remind them of their smallness. At the core of every vault and ledger is a trick older than gold. Turn nothing into everything, then convince the world that everything is scarce. Immanuel Kant warned us long before the age of skyscrapers and stock tickers that reality itself is an illusion. The world as it is, what he called the noumenon, is beyond our reach. We don't see reality, we sculpt it. Our senses carve the infinite into time and space, into cause and effect, into a story simple enough for us to live inside. What we call the world is not the thing itself, but the thing filtered, translated, imagined. And if reality is imagination, then those who control imagination control the world. That is the true purpose of power, to build illusions so convincing that we live and die by them. Schooling is one of those illusions. It pretends to teach you how to think, but really it teaches what to think. It does not expand your imagination. It narrows it until the walls of the classroom become the walls of the world. History becomes a story written by winners. Science becomes a gospel preached by men in white coats. And you learn to accept the structures handed to you, even as they chain your mind. Consider money. We are told it is scarce, that poverty is natural, that there is never enough for all. Yet the banking system was born from a sleight of hand so simple it borders on comedy. Merchants stored gold in vaults and issued receipts for it, receipts that soon became more valuable than the gold itself. Then they issued receipts without gold, confident that not everyone would demand their gold back at once. With each new piece of paper, wealth was created from thin air. That was the birth of modern finance, a spell that multiplies what does not exist and calls it real. From there, the trick only deepened. Banks began to form alliances, cartels sealed not just with contracts but with marriages. Together they learned to weather bank runs, crush kings who refused to pay their debts, and eventually evolve into the central banks that govern us today. These institutions can create infinite money at will. And yet somehow children still starve, families still go hungry, and entire nations live under mountains of debt. Why? Because poverty is not a failure of economics. It is a feature of control. It is the misery that makes wealth meaningful, the shadow that makes the carrot worth chasing. If money flowed freely, who would work the fields? Who would build the machines? Who would fight the wars? Scarcity is not a natural law. It is a performance. And crisis, market crashes, depressions, wars, are not random storms. They are rituals of destruction, designed to erase excess wealth and restore the illusion of value. The ancients knew this in their bones. They did not hoard wealth. They shared it. A man who struck gold threw a feast, not a retirement party. Prosperity was measured not in coins, but in community, in the hands you fed, the mouths you clothed. The individual was nothing without the whole. The worst punishment was not death, but exile, because to be cut off from the collective was to cease being human. Today, we are taught the opposite. We are taught that happiness is personal, that our problems begin and end within the self. Neuroscience replaces myth, synapses replace fate, and therapy replaces ritual. You are responsible, the new priests tell us. Your anger is your wiring. Your sadness is your chemistry. Fix yourself. And while you are busy fixing yourself, you forget to fix the world. This is the great genius of the modern order. It has turned collectivism into pathology. It has made rebellion feel like failure and solidarity feel like weakness. A people who blame themselves cannot act together. A people who see their suffering as personal cannot imagine that it was designed. And so we turn inward. We medicate. We isolate. We escape into screens and simulations, mistaking sedation for healing. The ancients, for all their gods and fatalism, were freer than we are. They believed that the universe was ruled by chaotic forces, pride, vengeance, fortune, and that these forces could ruin any plan, topple any king. And so, they lived well. They sought eudaimonia, flourishing, because tomorrow was not promised. They built, created, loved and fought, knowing that fate could snatch it all away. We, on the other hand, cling to pleasure and call it purpose. We pursue safety and call it freedom. And in our obsession with control, we have forgotten how to live. School was never meant to liberate you. It was meant to domesticate you, to rank, file, sort, and stamp you. Once, a child became a healer by apprenticing in a healer's hut. Once, knowledge was passed by hands, not by textbooks. Today, a child may study for 20 years and emerge knowing nothing but how to obey. Intelligence is not measured by wisdom or skill, but by compliance, by how well you repeat the answers on the test. All of this, money, school, science, even the very idea of the self, is part of the same architecture. It is a structure built to keep you working, consuming, doubting, obeying. It tells you that scarcity is real, that misery is your fault, that salvation is sold by experts. It convinces you that your chains are self-imposed, and in doing so, it makes it impossible to break. But remember Kant's lesson. Reality is not what it is, but what we imagine it to be. And if the imagination has been hijacked, then liberation begins not with revolution, but with reimagining. To see through the illusion is the first act of freedom. To rebuild the world on new terms, collective, abundant, fearless, is the second. They built schools the way generals build armies, not to teach, but to train, not to enlighten, but to condition. Sparta did it first, a warrior city-state where boys were torn from their mothers at 5, thrown into barracks, and beaten until fear itself became their tutor. The Aztecs followed, turning classrooms into crucibles, where discipline was carved into flesh. And then came Prussia, cold, efficient, relentless, whose blueprint for education became the model the whole world now follows. All three societies shared one thing: war. Sparta fought its neighbors. The Aztecs conquered and sacrificed. Prussia marched across Europe with a machine-like army. Their schools weren't temples of wisdom, they were factories for obedience. A society that wants to win wars needs soldiers who don't ask questions. It needs citizens who stand in line, follow orders, and believe without thinking. It needs children who've been trained not to rebel. But schooling did more than prepare bodies for battle. It prepared minds for control. Its first act was the oldest trick in the book: separation. It tore children from their parents. And when you take a child from the arms that make them feel safe, something breaks. Insecurity seeps in. Fear creeps close. And into that fear steps the teacher, the new authority, the surrogate parent. "Trust me," says the teacher, "I know better." And the child believes them, because what else is there to believe? It's the perfect moment to plant the seed, to shape a mind before it questions, to whisper a story before the child knows how to doubt. And the story they whisper is the same one whispered into you, that there is a nation, vast, eternal, sacred, that this nation is your mother, that you must love her, fight for her, die for her, that her name is more important than your own. Before schools, people didn't think like that. A man didn't say, "I am Chinese" or "I am French." He said, "I am from this village, this valley, this street." His loyalty was to the people he knew and the soil beneath his feet. But the nation demanded something larger, something abstract, a fiction powerful enough to bind millions of strangers into a single identity. And school was the forge where that fiction was hammered into shape. History became myth dressed as memory. Geography became sacred ground. Language became a badge of belonging. Day by day, lesson by lesson, children were taught not just to know, but to believe. And belief, once planted early, is harder to uproot than any chain forged from iron. This is the real curriculum of the classroom, not mathematics, not grammar, but obedience, patriotism, submission to authority, a belief that the map is more real than the land, that the state is more important than the village, that the story you've been given is the only one worth telling. And it works, because once you believe in the nation, you serve it. Once you love the flag, you'll die for it. Once you think of it as mother, you'll do anything she asks. The truth is, these ideas, money, the individual, the nation-state, are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are inventions, conjured from the imagination of men. 1,000 years ago, no one would have understood them. They would have called us slaves for believing in them. But here we are, living inside their illusion. Where did they come from? From the most powerful spell ever cast on the human mind. Monotheism. The idea that there is one God, one truth, and that all must kneel before it. It was monotheism that taught us to see the world as one order, ruled from above. From that root grew the idea of the singular nation, the sacred currency, the isolated individual. This is the alchemy of power, the art of turning nothing into everything. A worthless piece of paper into a banknote, a random line on a map into a motherland, a cluster of thoughts into a self. Power convinces you these things are real, so real you'll live and die for them, when they are, at their core, fictions. And yet, these fictions have teeth. They shape the walls of our reality. They decide who eats and who starves, who fights and who kneels. They give us order, yes, but also misery. They give us purpose, but also prisons. We were told life would get better with each generation. That progress was inevitable. That history was an arrow pointing up. But look around. We are richer and yet emptier, more connected and yet lonelier, more informed and yet more confused. The illusion has outgrown its makers, and now it rules us all. But if it was built by imagination, it can be rebuilt by imagination. If power created this world by shaping belief, then belief can unmake it. The same mind that accepted the story can rewrite it. The same story that enslaved us can set us free. The question is whether we dare to imagine something beyond it. America has always loved the sound of impact. The crack of a rifle, the thunderclap of bodies colliding under stadium lights, the drum roll of boots marching to distant drums. It is a nation that narrates itself through combat. Lexington and Concord, Antietam and Belleau Wood, Fallujah and Kabul, and every Friday night where helmets meet like meteors. Violence is not an aberration in the American story. It is one of its core idioms. There are more guns than people, hundreds of millions of them, many engineered to compress intention into a split second of irreversible reality. The Second Amendment isn't merely a clause. It's a creed. Football, the secular liturgy, teaches the same lesson in slow motion. Glory through collision, sacrifice as spectacle, concussion as the price of belonging. Even when the helmets come off, the culture keeps hitting. America's wars never really end. They fade into each other like tracks on a long road album. The revolution canonized rebellion. Manifest destiny sacralized conquest. Expansion west required the quiet of emptied land, and it was purchased with the loudest currency, gunfire. By the time blue and grey faced each other from cornfields and trenches, the country had already learned to solve arguments with artillery. The Civil War remains the deadliest American war because it was a war about America itself, not simply over slavery, which the North tolerated in law, until it sought to contain it, but over power, who decides, and from where. An industrial North, with railways, factories and 22 million people, confronted an agrarian South of 9 million, wealthy planters and enslaved labor at its core. For decades, the country tried to legislate the abyss, line by line, state by state, compromise by brittle compromise. Lincoln's election broke the balance. Secession followed. Invasion answered. "Save the Union," said the president. "End slavery if it saves it, Leave slavery if it saves it. Just save it. The North fought to keep the whole. The South fought to keep control. The nation chose artillery over arbitration. If that was the first great rupture, the second has been long in the making. The divide today is wider, more intricate and less negotiable. Inequality and debt have sorted the country into a narrow owning class and a broad owing class. The top slice of society not only holds accumulated wealth, it sits at the spigots where new wealth enters: credit creation, asset markets, policy levers. A rentier logic spreads profit from position, not production. Collect interest on everyone else's future. Layered on top are the culture wars, whose roots reach back to the country's birth. One founding current came to build a literal city upon a hill: Puritan moral order, covenant, scripture. The other current was Enlightenment fire: deism, reason, separation of church and state, a plural republic built by argument rather than creed. Those two rivers, covenant and reason, still crash into each other. Today they wear familiar costumes: a conservative, often Christian right, a secular multicultural left. The left is concentrated on the coasts, in universities, cities, and media capitals, where the money and the microphones live. The right sees wealth, rule-making, and respect pooled far from its towns. It feels managed rather than represented. Beneath both sites the imperial question: empire versus democracy. Wars and foreign reach enrich certain sectors at home: defense contractors, financiers, consultancies, while costs concentrate on the rest: taxes paid, sons and daughters deployed, debts carried, limbs and lives lost. The right grows more isolationist as the bills come due. The left is split between cosmopolitan management and anti-war dissent. The arguments rarely meet. They ricochet. Why a new civil conflict feels plausible. Three forces, already active, pull toward confrontation: militarization without a front. The country is saturated with weapons and tactics: guns in private hands, military kit in local police departments, a romance with force that runs from cinema to campaign ads. When institutions stall, militarized habits fill the vacuum. You don't need blue and grey lines to have a civil war. You need armed factions, certain they are defending the republic from the other half. Polarization hardened by institutions. The old Missouri Compromise instinct, split the difference, buy time, has failed. Gerrymandered districts reward purity over persuasion. Media ecosystems are sealed rooms with mirrored walls. Elections are treated less as transfers of power than as existential plebiscites on what America is. When both sides believe the other's victory is illegitimate by definition, the ballot becomes a prelude, not a conclusion. A rentier economy with moral jet fuel. When most people experience the system as rigged, assets levitating for the few, debt dragging the many, every cultural grievance acquires economic teeth. Moral outrage and material frustration fuse. That fusion is volatile. It makes compromise feel like surrender and patience feel like collusion. How it would manifest. A second civil war would not likely be Antietam 2.0. Think instead of a mosaic conflict, jurisdictional nullification, states and counties refusing federal directives, parallel legal regimes, sheriffs and governors daring Washington to enforce. Infrastructure pressure, strategic blockades, cyber sabotage, lawful strikes that halt ports, power, data, soft sieges without uniforms. Militia politics bleed, armed groups orbiting campaigns and courthouses, acting as security, then as enforcers, then as authors of facts on the ground. Flashpoint justice, contested prosecutions, lawfare, and selective enforcement escalating into targeted violence around trials and recounts. Information warfare, not just lies, but incompatible realities. Two public spheres with no translation layer, each deputizing its audience. No Appomattox, many Wacos. Not a map cleaved in half, but 1,000 hairline fractures spidering through institutions, jurisdictions, families. Every civil war rewrites the Constitution, officially or by practice. 3 plausible outcomes: centralization by shock, a federal reconsolidation after crisis, emergency powers that never quite sunset, a hardened national state justified by never again. Layered sovereignty, a looser union where states reclaim wide bandwidth, policy, culture, enforcement, while sharing currency, borders, and a minimal core. Managed balkanization, a de facto confederacy of regions and megacities, cross-cut by corporate platforms that become the real infrastructure of daily life. Whichever path emerges, the American myth will change. The old story, melting pot, frontier, perpetual new beginning, will give way to a colder narrative. Plural polities under one flag, coexisting by treaty more than by trust. Nothing here is destiny. Americans have chosen compromise before. They could choose it again. But compromise requires something scarce in the current atmosphere. A shared reality sturdy enough to hold disagreement, and institutions trusted enough to absorb it. Without those, America reaches for the only instrument it has trained itself to play with virtuosity. The drum beat is faint, then nearer. You hear it in stadiums and courtrooms, on cable panels and county roads. A nation fluent in force will use the language it knows unless it deliberately learns another. Learning a new language is possible. It starts the way every ceasefire starts, by deciding before the shot that there will be a morning after, one where both sides must live. First, the armament. We've already said it plainly. There are roughly 434 million guns in private hands in the United States, more firearms than people. So an ordinary person can reach for one or two with alarming ease. That is the baseline. Then walk into a small American town and look at the police motor pool. You might expect a couple of cruisers and a rack of service pistols. Instead, you find armored vehicles, sometimes even tracked ones, helicopters, ballistic vests stacked like gym weights, belt-fed weapons that belong on a FOB, not a cul-de-sac. Much of it is military surplus, and that's only the local tier. Above them sit state forces, the National Guard, an army in all but name. Above that, a thicket of federal agencies with enforcement arms of their own: FBI, DHS, CIA auxiliaries, NSA adjacent units, and a dozen less famous acronyms, each with its own tactical teams, aircraft, and toys. These are not merely investigative shops. They are, in capability, armies nested within an army. Now lift your eyes to the uniformed military itself. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and the new Space Force. To grasp the asymmetry, consider the sky. Ask who has the world's most powerful air forces, and the list becomes almost comic. First, the US Air Force. Second, the US Navy's aviation arm. Third, Russia. Fourth, the US Army's aviation. Fifth, the US Marine Corps. 4 out of 5 belong to one flag. That is what overmatch looks like. Inside this edifice, the special operations community has swollen far beyond the old carefully fenced remit. Special forces exist for extraordinary problems: hijackings, rescues, and deniable raids. The paradox is that the more exceptional units you raise, the less exceptional their use becomes, and the harder they are to control. Mexico offers the cautionary tale: cartel leadership salted with former commandos who took their training with them. In 2000, the United States fielded on the order of 38,000 special operators. Today, the number is nearly double. These are men and women trained in demolition, infiltration, and regime decapitation. It would take perhaps 1,000 such professionals, acting in concert, to cripple a national command structure. Delta Force alone, numbers about that. You don't need to indulge a thriller to see the risk. An ever-ready, over-capable, under-braked instrument looking for a theory of control. If hardware is the first problem, software is the second. The stories that once bound Americans to one another are fraying or already gone. The American dream, a promise that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you could own a house, raise a family and climb, has curdled into a cautionary tale about debt. Graduates carry student loans like millstones. Households balance credit card interest against rent. Mortgages recede into the distance for anyone not already aboard the asset ladder. Many young Americans have concluded that the game is not merely difficult, but rigged. That whatever they build will be skimmed by a financial class with a monopoly on the future. The second story was moral. America as a force for good, the steward of liberty abroad. That too is contested from both ends. On the left, the curriculum emphasizes a founding in slavery and expansion through violence. On the right, a suspicion that spreading democracy is often a euphemism for adventurism that leaves ordinary people to pay with blood and taxes. The wars of the last 2 decades, the images from the Middle East, the permanent wartime posture, each has chipped away at the halo. Fewer citizens accept the old benedictions at face value. The third story was procedural, the creed of liberalism itself. Even if we disagree, we said, we can argue it out. Free speech, open debate, evidence, norms, compromise. But 2016 broke something fragile. A large share of liberals decided after Trump's victory that the problem wasn't just the candidate. The problem was the electorate. That some portion of the public could not be reasoned with at all. Once that conclusion hardens, liberalism collapses from the inside. Why defend speech if speech cannot persuade? Why defend process if process yields the wrong people? When the middle story dies, the middle ground goes with it. That leads to the third failure: authority itself. Institutions once trusted across factions now attract only suspicion. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq looked, in retrospect, like disasters without necessity. The financial crisis of 2008 felt like legalized theft. Banks rescued, households wrecked, the reckoners promoted. The pandemic, lockdowns, school closures, mandates, the churn of edicts and counter-edicts convinced many that expertise is a mask that slips. Congress polls in the basement. National media are derided as class organs. Universities are battlefields rather than referees. Even the military's credibility erodes under the strain of endless mission creep and episodic failure. And when a former president is convicted on dozens of counts, half the country celebrates while the other half decides the courts are political too. One by one, the pillars have cracked. There is no widely trusted institution left to broker a truce. Put the three together: an over-militarized landscape, a vacuum of shared stories, a collapse of arbiters, and a civil war stops looking like a fever dream and starts resembling the path of least resistance. It will not look like 1861. There will be no neat line across a map, no uniforms in contrasting wool. It will arrive as a long season of episodes. The first will be kinetic but familiar: riots and street unrest, rolling waves of protest and counter-protest that spike after elections or verdicts. We've seen the rehearsal. We will see the sequel. The next phase is personal. Neighbors turning on neighbors in places where red and blue live a fence apart. Shootings that are small in number and large in symbolism. Each one another solvent poured on civic bonds. From there, the stakes rise. A city or a state, New York, California, floats secession, not as theater but as policy. They have police, guard units, budgets and media megaphones. Others would challenge them swiftly, and the confrontation would be a war in everything but name. Beyond open defiance lie insurgencies, ideologically driven cadres, religious or secular, which move from rhetoric to parallel governance. Shadow courts, shadow policing, shadow taxation, in sympathetic counties. And behind even that is the quietest and most dangerous possibility. A coup, not by tanks on the mall, but by a sliver of elite operators who know exactly which switches to flip and which cables to cut. In such a system, you don't need to hold territory to seize power. You need to paralyze nerve centers long enough to dictate new terms. Along the way, turnout falls. November arrives and fewer voters bother to register their preference. 4 years ago, many came to expel a man they thought menaced democracy. Now a great many don't believe democracy has the strength to menace much of anything. Whoever wins inherits not a mandate, but a hostage, government by people who have already given up. This is not prophecy. It is a sketch made from present lines. The United States could still choose the harder alternative, rebuild the middle story, restore the referees, retire the romance with force. But choices are made with habits as much as with words, and the habits right now point the other way. When every part of a system is armed, faithless, and certain of its private truth, the quietest sound in the room is compromise. The loudest is the click of a safety coming off. America behaves like an empire because it is one, and empires eventually fight to prove they still are. To see why, rewind to the America of 1950 to 1980, a country built around factories. Manufacturing wasn't a niche, it was the spine. It accounted for roughly 40% of corporate profits and employed about a third of the workforce. The arsenal of democracy that had stamped out tanks and bombers pivoted after 1945 to refrigerators, cars and televisions, consumer abundance on an assembly line. If you were a line worker in that era, you lived what later generations would only read about: a 40-hour week, a mortgage within reach, employer health insurance, a single income that could support a spouse at home, 3 or 4 kids, 2 cars in the driveway, a family vacation every year, dinners out, and at the end of it, a pension you could count on. Measured against global standards, the mid-century American working class wasn't just comfortable, it was historically privileged. Then in the 1980s came the turn. Call it the Reagan Revolution, call it neoliberalism. The name matters less than the effect. The reigning faith shifted from industrial policy and managed capitalism to deregulation and the primacy of markets. Factories migrated or were dismantled. Balance sheets and trading floors took center stage. The American economy was financialized. On paper, the new order looks tidy. Financial services now contribute roughly a fifth of GDP and capture close to 40% of corporate profits, while employing a sliver of the labor force. Manufacturing, once the heavyweight, has withered to about 1/10 of output. But those ratios aren't just columns in an almanac. They describe a civilizational pivot, a reassignment of power and prestige. Start with politics. In the factory era, organized labor anchored the middle class in public life. Unions bargained at the plant and lobbied at the State House. Working people had institutions that translated wages into voice. In the financial era, that center of gravity migrated to Wall Street and its ecosystem of lawyers, consultants, and asset managers. To the professional managerial elite concentrated on the coasts, credentialed by elite universities, fluent in the dialect of capital. Policy now flows through their priorities, which reliably favor the mobility of money over the stability of wages. The result isn't subtle. The country's governing project tilts toward the interests of a multicultural, highly educated, financial class, and away from the people who once made and moved things. Education followed politics. In 1965, the dream graduate of a top university might chase a lab, a classroom, a shop floor, or a shop of one's own. Today, the default ambition is a desk on a trading floor or a seat at a fund. PhDs in statistics and machine learning, who might have built the next generation of productive tools, now design trading strategies, pricing models, and risk engines. The talent migration isn't morally scandalous so much as strategically revealing. A society that pulls its keenest minds towards speculation will, over time, speculate more than it builds. The macroeconomy responded in kind. When finance becomes the meta-industry, volatility becomes a way of life. The dot-com implosion at the start of the century, the subprime collapse and global crisis in 2008, the rolling seizures of banks thereafter. These aren't isolated storms, they're weather patterns. A healthy banking system is supposed to fail rarely and quietly. An over-financialized one fails loudly and often, then writes itself emergency rule books to do it again. All of this, the political realignment, the educational funnel, the macro volatility, feeds back into imperial behavior. A society that no longer derives broad prosperity from making things will look outward for returns and inward for control. Outward to enforce dollar primacy, secure trade routes, and manage energy flows. Inward to paper over domestic fractures with narratives of global purpose. It is easier to rally a service-heavy, finance-led economy around grand strategy than around the closing of a local plant. The former can be sold as national leadership. The latter sounds like retreat, which returns us to Iran. From the perspective of an empire defending its status, Iran is not just a country. It is a junction box, oil, shipping lanes, regional influence, and a stubborn refusal to accept the hierarchies that make the dollar king. To punish, deter, and re-establish credibility fits the imperial playbook perfectly. To avoid the war would require a different playbook altogether. Re-industrialization at home, a smaller financial sector, and a tolerance for a more plural world abroad. That is a tall order for a system whose institutions, incentives, and elites have been trained for 40 years to do the opposite. The final prediction, the loss, follows from those same structures. Empires that depend on finance and narrative are exquisitely powerful at a distance and surprisingly brittle up close. They excel at sanctioning, signaling, and surveilling. They struggle when the problem set demands attrition, patience, and sacrifice across classes. A war with Iran would expose precisely those weaknesses. Logistics stretched, alliances hedging, home front ambivalent, markets skittish, politics poisonous. You can win battles under those conditions. You rarely win endings. None of this is fated. It is, however, path-dependent. We built an economy that moved profit away from production and power away from the people who produce. We trained our best students to arbitrage rather than to invent. We learned to treat credibility as a currency earned abroad because we stopped earning it at home. An empire organized like that eventually reaches for a war to prove itself. And when it does, the proof often works in the other direction. The reason all of this happened is because America fundamentally changed what it was. It stopped being a nation built on production and became a global empire built on finance. That transformation didn't just tweak the edges of the system, it rewired the DNA of the entire republic. Look at the landscape today. Every major asset class in America, housing, equities, tech, is bloated like a pig at a trough. Everyone's bets that prices will only rise, that the wheel will spin forever upward. But that's what bubbles always look like before they burst. And when they do, they tear through everything, jobs, pensions, homes, leaving chaos behind. Meanwhile, inequality yawns wider than it has in a century. The top 1% hoards not just wealth, but the means to generate more of it. For everyone else, upward mobility calcifies. If you're young, you don't dream of buying a home, you dream of qualifying to rent one. The very notion of moving up becomes a cruel joke in a rentier economy. So how did we get here? How did a nation that once built and invented its way to power end up speculating itself into fragility? Some say it's just capitalism aging badly, the natural endpoint of an old system. Others blame neoliberalism, the Reagan-era gospel that deregulated markets, stripped away public protections, and put faith in the invisible hand. There's truth in both, but the deeper reason runs colder and older. America became an empire, and empires do not play by the same rules as nations. They write the rules, to make sure they always win. To understand how, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1776, America announced itself to the world with a promise, a new society, grounded not in kings or bloodlines, but in God and in rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But happiness, as Thomas Jefferson wrote it, was not a feeling. It meant property, wealth, accumulation, the freedom to build and hoard and pass it down. The founders believed that if every citizen were free to pursue wealth, the nation itself would become powerful. They were right. Within a century and a half, America had industrialized at breakneck speed. By the end of the Second World War, it was the richest, most powerful country on earth. And with that power came the temptation and the opportunity to reshape the world in its image. In 1944, before the war had even ended, the US and its allies met in a quiet New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods to redraw the global financial order. The deal they struck crowned the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Anyone, anywhere, could use it to buy anything. It was as if the US had turned its paper into gold, because in fact, it did. The dollar was pegged to gold, and anyone holding dollars could walk into a US bank and claim the metal itself. It was a system that enriched America and stabilized much of the post-war world. Then, in 1971, Nixon tore up the deal. America had spent too much, on Vietnam, on space, on itself, and the gold link was a shackle it could no longer bear. The dollar would float free. But free money is worthless without something real behind it. So, Washington struck a new bargain. This time not with bankers, but with oil barons. Saudi Arabia and its neighbors agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars. Every nation on earth needs oil, and now every nation on earth needed dollars to get it. Thus was born the petrodollar, and with it a new era of American financial dominance. The last piece fell into place in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended. With no rival superpower left to check it, the US didn't just shape the rules, it set them unilaterally. It promised a world made rich by trade, a world where each nation specialized in what it did best and exchanged those goods freely. It promised that capital would flow to the places where it could grow the fastest, lifting poor nations toward prosperity and rich ones toward efficiency. These were the high doctrines of globalization, taught in every economics classroom and treated as gospel. But reality didn't read the textbooks. Trade did not lift all boats. It built super yachts for a few and left the rest bailing water. Wages in places like China stagnated for decades because the wealth generated by globalization was captured by a tiny elite. And those elites didn't invest their windfalls back home. They funneled them into US assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, not because the returns were highest, but because the money was safest there. In theory, capital seeks growth. In practice, capital seeks shelter. And America, as the imperial center, offered the safest harbor of all. This is how an industrial nation becomes a financial empire. It creates a global system in which everyone else's growth depends on its currency, everyone else's savings flow back into its markets, and everyone else's stability hinges on its whims. That's how bubbles inflate in Manhattan when wages stagnate in Guangzhou. That's how a tech stock crash in Silicon Valley can ripple through São Paulo and Lagos. That's how America ended up with an economy that makes fortunes out of thin air, and then watches them evaporate just as quickly. But empires built on finance are brittle in ways empires built on steel were not. They are rich in illusions and poor in resilience. Their wealth is not forged but imagined, and imagination, as history teaches, can change. The empire America built after 1991 is the most powerful the world has ever known precisely because it controls the story everyone else must believe. But when that story falters, when people stop believing the dollar will always be king or that capital will always come home, the empire trembles. And tremors have a way of becoming earthquakes. Because the United States issues the currency the world saves in, global wealth naturally seeks shelter in US banks and US markets. It isn't just China, it's almost everyone. In the 1990s, that tide began to surge, and by the early 2000s it was a flood. The result was simple and devastating. Everything in America became a tradable speculation. Houses, stocks, startups, each wave of foreign savings swelled the same shoreline, pushing prices higher and tempting Wall Street to invent ever riskier vessels to ride the swell. You can see this imperial concentration of wealth most starkly in equities. In 1900, the global stock market was recognizably multipolar. Britain held about a quarter of the world's equity value. The United States sat around 14.5%, with Germany and France close behind. That map made sense for an industrial age. Today, it is not. By 2024, the United States commands roughly 60% of global stock wealth. Second place? Japan, at about 6%. China, the world's second-largest economy by output, hovers near 3%. The asymmetry is the story. Profits are earned everywhere, but savings come home to one place. An industry grew to receive and recycle that money. Not factories, but finance. The key to Wall Street's business model is not performance, it's custody. Fees accrue on assets under management, not on the creation of real wealth. That incentive structure tilts the whole system toward product engineering, derivatives, structured products, shiny new wrappers, because novelty attracts flows, and flows generate fees. Prudence has no lobby. Marketing does. The more capital the world parks in America, the more exotic the vehicles become, and the more fragile the system feels beneath its glossy surface. All of this sits atop a federal balance sheet that swells year after year. The national debt is counted in the tens of trillions. A large share is held abroad by creditors like Japan and China, the rest by Americans through pensions and funds. Servicing that debt is now one of Washington's largest expenses, alongside the military and the promises made to retirees. Everyone can see the arithmetic bending. Everyone can do the bleak little math. And yet foreign creditors keep buying US treasuries. Why? Because dollars still buy oil. The petrodollar compact persists, because US power still deters predators, and most of all because there is, for now, nowhere comparably deep and safe to go. In theory, this arrangement could drift on indefinitely, the numbers climbing like ivy up an old wall. In practice, it lasts only as long as the world believes the wall won't crack. That is why Russia's invasion of Ukraine matters far beyond its borders. On one level, it is a regional war with unspeakable human costs. On another, it is a stress test of the American order. Vladimir Putin wagered that the American empire is performative, its military reputation a paper shield, its will eroded by distance and decadence. If he can win that bet, if he can outlast sanctions, fragment alliances, and force a settlement on his terms, then the story that anchors the dollar cracks. The empire begins to look beatable. Safe assets look less safe. Capital, at the margins, begins to glance elsewhere. There is, in principle, a clean answer for America. Rebuild the productive base. If the country reindustrialized, if it made more of what it uses and exported more of what it makes, the empire of paper would once again rest on steel, silicon, and ships. The trouble is not technical capacity. The trouble is politics and culture. Finance dominates the commanding heights and does not intend to hand them back. A speculative era also reshapes ambition. Why pull shifts in a plant for 40 years when a lucky trade can move you further, faster? Even if the politics could be bent toward factories, you would still need patient capital for plants, ports, and logistics, and a generation willing to staff them. None of that appears overnight. So, if America cannot quickly beat Russia in Ukraine, and cannot quickly rebuild its industrial core, what option remains for an empire whose strength depends on belief? The bleak answer is to stage a demonstration, something dramatic enough to reassert military primacy, to steady foreign creditors, and to harden the floor beneath the dollar. In this logic, Iran becomes the target of choice. You don't pick a nuclear peer. You pick a state whose defeat you believe you can orchestrate at acceptable cost. The strategic case, as its advocates would frame it, runs in 3 lines. First, shock and awe restores the aura. Markets are stories with price tags. If America crushes a regional adversary swiftly, the story that US power is ultimate gets a new chapter. Nervous holders of US assets breathe easier. Second, oil underwrites the dollar. If the Middle East produces roughly 40% of the world's crude, and Iran sits athwart some of the richest reservoirs and tightest straits, then dominating that theater helps lock the petrodollar back in place. Third, shipping lanes are leverage. The world's trade flows through choke points that a victorious US could patrol or pressure at will. Control of energy and logistics reinforces the currency, and the currency keeps the capital coming. None of this is an endorsement. It is an X-ray of the imperial mind at a moment of doubt. Empires live on confidence. When confidence wobbles, they reach for spectacle. The tragedy is that spectacle begets consequences, insurgencies, blowback, markets that absorb the shock in strange ways. And even if the show works, even if the aura brightens for a season, the underlying fracture remains, a financialized core balanced on global savings and faith. This is why the chapter ends where it began. The United States did not simply become rich. It became the place where the world stores its fears and hopes in the form of dollars. That privilege created the habits, incentives, and addictions that now make real transformation so hard. Toppling Tehran would be a theater of reassurance. Reindustrializing America would be a cure. One is fast and brittle, the other is slow and strong. History suggests empires prefer the fast answer until they are finally forced to choose the hard one. Today, across Africa, governments and movements that once feared Western power are openly defying it. They're ejecting French troops, denouncing American influence, and inviting new partners into their capitals. Why now? Because they believe the balance of power has shifted, that Vladimir Putin has punctured the myth of American invincibility. The same perception emboldened Hamas on October 7th. For years, no actor in the Middle East would have dared such a provocation. But the war in Ukraine sent a signal that rippled far beyond Eastern Europe. The United States is not untouchable. It can be challenged. This is precisely why Washington now faces a strategic imperative. To preserve its financial empire, the system that funnels the world's wealth into dollars, into US assets, into Wall Street, America must prove once again that it is the preeminent military power on Earth. If it does not, confidence erodes, and if that confidence collapses, so does the empire's economic core. China, Japan, and others would begin pulling their reserves from US bonds. They would sell treasuries and unwind their dollar holdings. That chain reaction would trigger a sovereign debt crisis in Washington and choke off the easy money that has lubricated American life for decades. This addiction to easy money is not a footnote. It is the defining feature of the imperial age. America has grown used to wealth without work, to fortunes conjured not by labor, but by speculation, leverage, and asset inflation. A society accustomed to conjuring millions with keystrokes cannot imagine returning to the slow grind of industrial toil. It is precisely this dependency that drives the urge to wage another war, and why Iran, more than any other target, is in Washington's crosshairs. But there is a paradox here, and it cuts to the heart of imperial behavior. As one student asked, if the purpose of attacking Iran is to restore faith in American supremacy, what happens if the United States loses? Wouldn't that destroy faith entirely? It's the right question, and it exposes a deeper problem. Empires suffer from what historians call imperial hubris, the inability to imagine defeat. By definition, an empire imposes its version of reality on others. It dictates the terms of truth. There is no feedback loop. Subjects may grumble, but they cannot change the narrative. And when a state grows accustomed to shaping reality itself, it loses the capacity to see its own fragility. It cannot conceive of failure, and so it marches toward it blind. The second reason empires fail is psychological. If you ask most people whether they'd rather be smart and strategic or stupid and arrogant, they'll say they want to be smart. But in truth, stupidity paired with arrogance feels better. It's easy. It shields you from doubt. It spares you from the discomfort of questioning yourself. Power amplifies this tendency. The more powerful a state becomes, the more insulated it is from consequences, and the more likely it is to choose arrogance over caution. This is why empires that once seemed eternal always end the same way. They overreach, convinced that they cannot fall. The American empire has been building toward this moment for decades. Its foundations were laid after World War II, when Washington controlled half the world's wealth and influence. It became unrivaled after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States stood alone. During the Cold War, American capitalism had to behave itself, not because of Soviet tanks, but because of the specter of communism. It was the idea, not the armies, that Washington feared. If capitalism failed to deliver prosperity to its workers, communism might seduce them. That fear was why, from the 1950s to the 1980s, American laborers enjoyed unprecedented wages, benefits, and security. The threat of ideological competition kept capitalism honest. But today there is no ideological rival. Communism has withered, and nothing substantial has replaced it. There is no competing vision of how society should be organized, no serious, alternative model of political economy. And so, America feels free to act without restraint. It no longer fears revolt from below or resistance from abroad. That absence of fear, combined with imperial hubris and addiction to easy money, is precisely what makes the next war more likely. If the United States invades Iran, it will not be purely about oil or Israel or even Tehran's nuclear ambitions. It will be about something far more existential: the survival of an empire that has forgotten how to doubt itself. And if history is any guide, that is when empires are at their most dangerous and their most vulnerable.